The moment that shattered my world wasn't the discovery of hidden bank accounts or secret credit cards. It wasn't finding receipts for $1,000 dinners while we ate mac and cheese for the third night in a row. It was my 8-year-old son's voice, small and confused, asking, "Mommy, why does Daddy have shopping bags when he said we couldn't buy my school shoes because we have no money?" I stood there in that mall parking lot, watching my husband load luxury shopping bags into his car. The same man who had looked our son in the eyes 2 hours earlier and said we couldn't afford the $20 sneakers he desperately needed. In that moment, I realized I had been living with a stranger who had been stealing not just money, but our child's sense of security, his trust in the word family. How long does it take for a lie to become someone's entire reality? For 3 years, I had believed every word that came out of his mouth about our financial situation. Every, "we can't afford it," when our son asked for a school field trip. Every, "maybe next month," when I suggested we finally fix the leaking roof. Every, "you don't understand how tight things are," when I wondered why we never seemed to get ahead despite his supposedly good job. I had become an expert at stretching $5 into a week's worth of meals, at finding free activities for a child who watched his friends go to amusement parks and summer camps. I sold my grandmother's jewelry to pay for his car repairs, convinced that we were a team facing hardship together. I took pride in my resourcefulness, and how well I could make nothing look like something when relatives visited. My son learned to say, "That's okay, Mom," before I even had to say no, and my heart broke a little more each time. But I told myself this was temporary, that we were building character, that love could fill the gaps that money couldn't. What I didn't know was that the gap wasn't in our bank account, it was in his conscience. The marriage had started with such promise, built on what I thought was honesty and shared dreams. We met in college, both of us working multiple jobs to pay for tuition, both understanding what it meant to count every dollar. He proposed with a ring he saved for months to buy, and I loved him more for the sacrifice than the diamond itself. Those early years were lean but happy. We laughed about our thrift store furniture and celebrated with home-cooked meals instead of expensive restaurants. When our son was born, we planned carefully, budgeting for diapers and daycare with the precision of financial analysts. I went back to work part-time, taking freelance projects from home so I could be there for bedtime stories and scraped knees. He seemed proud of how well I managed our household, how I could make $1 stretch like elastic. But somewhere along the way, his appreciation turned into expectation, and his partnership turned into performance. When did his praise for my frugality become permission for his excess? I remember the first time I questioned the math that governed our lives. Our son was 5, and he wanted a bicycle for his birthday. Nothing fancy, just something with training wheels from the local discount store. The price tag was $48, and my husband shook his head sadly, explaining that we simply didn't have it in the budget. But that same week, I noticed he had new dress shirts, expensive ones with designer labels still attached. When I asked about them, he said his company had provided them for client meetings, that appearances mattered in his line of work. I believed him because I wanted to, because questioning felt like betraying the team we were supposed to be. Our son got a second-hand bike from a garage sale instead, wobbly and rust-spotted but functional. He rode it with such joy that I convinced myself we had made the right choice, that teaching him gratitude was more valuable than teaching him entitlement. How many times did I talk myself out of the truth before it finally talked back? Before I go any further, I need to ask you something that's been weighing on my heart. Have you ever loved someone so completely that you made their version of reality your own, even when your instincts screamed that something was wrong? Have you ever been the person who believed every excuse, who took responsibility for problems you didn't create, who convinced yourself that sacrifice was the same as love? If stories like mine resonate with the voice in your head that whispers, "Me too," please subscribe to this channel now. Because what I discovered next isn't just about money. It's about how deception becomes a second language in some relationships, and how sometimes the people we trust most are the ones slowly stealing our lives. The revelation that's coming will change how you look at every "we can't afford it" that's ever been whispered in your home. The first crack in his carefully constructed story appeared on a Tuesday morning in March. I was sorting through our son's backpack when I found a crumpled receipt that had somehow made its way from his father's pocket to the bottom of his school bag. It was from an upscale restaurant downtown, the kind with valet parking and entrees that cost more than our weekly grocery budget. The date was from the previous Thursday, when my husband claimed he was working late on a project and came home after midnight with apologies and exhaustion. The receipt showed a dinner for two with wine that cost more than our car payment, and a total that made my hands shake as I calculated how many school lunches, how many utilities payments, how many of our son's small disappointments that single meal represented. But what haunted me wasn't the money itself. It was the lie that wrapped around it like poisoned silk. Who was the second person at that table while I was home rationing peanut butter to last until payday? I started paying attention differently after that. The way you listen to music when you suspect there's a message hidden in the lyrics. His phone, which used to sit casually on the kitchen counter, now lived permanently in his pocket. His work clothes, which I had always washed and pressed with wife-like dedication, began disappearing into a dry cleaning service I had never heard of. When I asked about the expense, he explained that his job now required a certain level of presentation, and that the company reimbursed him for professional cleaning. I wanted to believe this too, wanted to return to the comfortable fiction of our shared struggle, but doubt had moved into my chest like a tenant who planned to stay. I found myself studying his face when he talked about money, looking for the small tells that betrayed the performance. The way his eyes shifted left when he mentioned unexpected expenses. The way his voice got slightly higher when he explained why we couldn't afford something our son needed. The way he changed the subject just a little too quickly when I suggested we review our budget together. When did I become a detective in my own marriage? Our son, innocent and observant in the way only children can be, began asking questions that cut through his father's carefully rehearsed explanations, like a knife through tissue paper. Daddy, why do you have new shoes but mine have holes? Why can't we go to Disney World like Emma's family if you work so hard? Why do you smell like fancy restaurants when you come home if we only eat chicken nuggets? Each question was a small dagger to my husband's composure, and I watched him deflect with increasing irritation, teaching our child that questions about money were somehow rude or inappropriate. The message our son absorbed wasn't about financial responsibility. It was about not trusting his own observations, about accepting explanations that made no sense, about normalizing a reality where nothing added up. I watched my child learn to doubt his own eyes, and that's when maternal instinct overrode wifely loyalty. What kind of father teaches his son that reality is negotiable? The man I had married seemed to evaporate a little more each day, replaced by someone who spoke in corporate buzzwords and treated our family like a budget line item he could manipulate. When our son brought home a permission slip for a field trip to the Science Museum, $22 that would have covered admission and lunch, my husband didn't even look up from his phone as he said no. But I had seen the credit card statement he forgot to hide, had seen charges for golf club memberships and premium streaming services, and subscription boxes filled with luxury items he claimed to know nothing about. The disconnect between his public poverty and his private purchases was becoming impossible to ignore, like trying not to notice that someone is speaking a foreign language while insisting they're speaking English. He had created two financial universes, one where we were struggling paycheck to paycheck, and another where money flowed like water for his personal pleasure. The cruelest part wasn't the deception itself, but how he made our son feel responsible for our supposed financial shortfall, as if a child's simple needs were the burden that kept us from prosperity. I remember the exact moment I decided to stop being complicit in my own deception. Our son's school was having a book fair, and he came home with bright eyes and a list of books he wanted to buy. The total was $12 for 3 paperbacks, and when he showed his father the list, the response was swift and cutting. "We've talked about this, son. Money doesn't grow on trees." But that afternoon, I watched my husband stop at Starbucks for a $15 specialty coffee drink and a pastry, spending more on a single indulgent moment than our son was asking for to feed his growing mind. The casual cruelty of it, the way he could deny our child's intellectual curiosity while satisfying his own momentary cravings, made something cold and determined settle into my bones. I realized I wasn't looking at financial irresponsibility. I was looking at calculated selfishness dressed up as shared sacrifice. How long could I pretend not to see what was right in front of me? My sister Diana had always been the blunt one in our family, the person who said what others only thought. When I finally confided in her about the receipt, about the contradictions that were multiplying like cancer cells, her response was immediate and unwavering. He's been playing you for years, and you need to document everything. She didn't tell me I was imagining things or that all marriages had their financial mysteries. Instead, she helped me create a strategy for uncovering the truth without alerting him to my investigation. Diana taught me how to check credit reports, how to trace spending patterns, how to follow digital breadcrumbs that liars always leave behind. Most importantly, she reminded me that protecting our son meant protecting myself first, that I couldn't be a good mother while living in a fantasy constructed by someone else's lies. She was the voice of reason I had silenced in myself, the external validation that my suspicions weren't paranoia but survival instinct finally awakening. Sometimes you need someone else to tell you that the ground beneath your feet really is shifting, that you're not crazy for noticing the earthquake everyone else insists isn't happening. Diana helped me understand that what I was experiencing wasn't just financial infidelity. It was emotional abuse disguised as fiscal responsibility. Every time my husband made our son feel guilty for wanting normal childhood experiences, he was teaching him that his needs didn't matter. Every time he made me feel foolish for questioning expenses that didn't add up, he was conditioning me to doubt my own intelligence. The pattern was as clear as it was devastating. Make the victims responsible for the victimization. Make the deceived feel grateful for the deception. She showed me articles about financial abuse, helped me recognize the tactics I had been accepting as normal marital dynamics. The gaslighting, the control through artificial scarcity, the way he positioned himself as the responsible adult while painting me and our son as burdens he nobly carried. Diana's anger on my behalf was liberating. Finally, someone was as outraged as I should have been all along. Why had I been so afraid to trust my own perceptions? Armed with Diana's support and my own growing determination, I began to document everything with the precision of a forensic accountant. Every mysterious expense, every contradiction between his claims and his actions, every time our son was denied something while his father indulged himself. I created a spreadsheet that would have impressed the IRS, tracking patterns of deception that painted a picture more damning than I had imagined. The man who claimed we couldn't afford our son's school photos had spent $300 on wine in a single month. The man who said family vacations were financially irresponsible had been taking weekend trips to expensive hotels, always claiming they were work-related while providing no documentation. The numbers told a story of systematic betrayal, of a man who had chosen his own comfort over his family's well-being at every opportunity. But I still needed something undeniable, something he couldn't explain away with more elaborate lies. I needed to catch him in the act of being the person he really was, instead of the person he pretended to be. The confrontation I had been avoiding came naturally one evening when our son asked if we could order pizza for dinner. It was a simple request, the kind of small family pleasure that costs less than $20 and creates memories that last forever. My husband's response was automatic. "You know we can't afford things like that right now. Maybe when Dad gets a raise." But I had just seen him purchase a pair of $70 wireless earbuds that afternoon, had watched him justify the expense as necessary for work calls. The hypocrisy was so blatant, so casual, that something inside me snapped like a wire stretched too far. I looked at our son's disappointed face, then at my husband's completely unbothered expression, and realized I was watching child abuse in real time. The slow, steady erosion of a little boy's sense of worth and security. The words came out of my mouth before I could stop them. Funny how work equipment is always affordable, but our son's happiness never is. The silence that followed was electric with the possibility of finally telling the truth. His reaction to my challenge was immediate and revealing. Not guilt or embarrassment, but anger at being questioned. He didn't deny the earbuds or explain the discrepancy. Instead, he attacked me for keeping track of his purchases, for not understanding how business expenses worked, for making him feel guilty about trying to provide for our family. The deflection was so smooth, so practiced, that I realized this wasn't the first time he had been caught. It was just the first time I had been brave enough to voice my observations. He spoke to me like a parent scolding a child for not understanding adult complexities, but his condescension only clarified how deliberate his deception had been. This wasn't financial irresponsibility born from ignorance or pressure. This was systematic manipulation designed to maximize his freedom while minimizing our expectations. The most chilling part was how quickly he shifted from defense to offense, making my reasonable questions seem like unreasonable attacks. When did asking for honesty become a betrayal in our marriage? I went to bed that night, knowing that the confrontation had solved nothing and revealed everything. He wasn't going to confess, wasn't going to apologize, wasn't going to change. Instead, he was going to get better at hiding, more creative with his excuses, more careful about covering his tracks. The performance of poverty would continue, but now I was outside the theater looking at the stage lighting and seeing how the illusion was created. I needed evidence so clear, so undeniable, that even he couldn't twist it into another story about sacrifice and responsibility. I needed to catch him not just spending money he claimed we didn't have, but actively lying about where it went and why. The next morning I made a decision that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. I was going to follow him, not because I didn't trust him, but because I had finally learned to trust myself. Sometimes the only way to prove someone is lying is to witness the truth they're trying to hide. The investigation that followed felt like learning to see in color after a lifetime of black and white. I discovered bank accounts I didn't know existed, credit cards in his name only with balances that exceeded our annual family income. I found receipts for jewelry I had never seen, clothing that never appeared in our closet, restaurant charges that corresponded perfectly with nights he claimed to be working late. The most painful discoveries were the recurring charges, expensive gym memberships when he told me we couldn't afford our son's soccer registration, premium dating app subscriptions that made my blood turn to ice water, luxury car payments for a vehicle I had never seen. Each piece of evidence was like finding another room in a house I thought I knew completely. The financial infidelity was staggering, but the emotional betrayal was bottomless. He hadn't just been stealing money. He had been stealing our son's childhood, my peace of mind, our family's future. Every "we can't afford it" had been a lie designed to keep more money available for his secret life. But the smoking gun came in the form of something so mundane I almost overlooked it. A gym receipt tucked into his wallet that I was searching for our insurance card when our son needed urgent care. The receipt wasn't just for a membership. It was for personal training sessions at a facility across town. Sessions that cost more per hour than I spent on groceries per week. The kicker was the date and time. Saturdays at noon, when he claimed to be working overtime at the office. When I was home with our son explaining why Daddy had to work so much just to keep us afloat. I called the gym pretending to be his secretary trying to reschedule, and the cheerful receptionist confirmed that he had been a member for over a year, that his sessions were always with the same trainer, and that his account was current on all payments. The elaborate lie wasn't just about money, it was about time, about priorities, about choosing personal pleasure over family presence. While I was telling our son that Daddy was working hard for our family, Daddy was working out for himself, spending money he claimed we didn't have on a body he was maintaining for reasons that had nothing to do with his marriage. The moment of complete clarity came 3 weeks later, when I found myself parked across from that same upscale restaurant where the receipt had started this journey. I watched my husband walk in laughing with a woman I didn't recognize, watched him hold the door for her with the kind of attentiveness he hadn't shown me in years. They were seated at a window table, and I could see them through the glass, sharing appetizers and intimate conversation, his body language relaxed and animated in a way I rarely witnessed anymore at home. The bill for that dinner, which I would find on his hidden credit card statement days later, was more than we spent on our son's school clothes for the entire year. But the money was secondary to the revelation. This wasn't financial irresponsibility, or poor budgeting, or temporary pressure from work. This was a double life, carefully constructed and meticulously maintained, funded by the poverty he imposed on his own family. I sat in that parking lot for 2 hours, not because I needed more evidence, but because I needed time to let the full weight of the betrayal settle into my bones. The man who told our son we couldn't afford a pizza was buying wine that cost more than our car payment for a woman who would never know the sacrifice she represented. The drive home that night was the longest and shortest trip of my life. Endless because I knew everything was about to change. Instant because years of questions suddenly had answers. I walked into our house and looked at our son doing homework at the kitchen table with a pen he had borrowed from school because we couldn't afford to buy supplies until next payday, and I felt something crystallize inside me that was harder than anger and cleaner than rage. This wasn't just about a cheating husband or hidden money anymore. This was about a child who had been systematically taught that his needs didn't matter, that love meant accepting less than you deserved, that family meant constant disappointment disguised as virtue. The man I had married had been conducting an experiment in how much humiliation a woman and child would accept if you packaged it as shared hardship. The experiment was over, and he was about to learn what happened when the subjects figured out they had been lab rats all along. When he came home that night, smelling faintly of expensive perfume and wine, with the same tired expression he always wore after his overtime shifts, I was ready with a question that would end the performance forever. How was dinner at Marcello's? The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might faint, and in that moment of stunned silence, I saw him as he really was. Not a devoted family man making hard sacrifices, but a common thief who had been robbing his own childhood to fund his selfish pleasures. He didn't ask how I knew, didn't deny where he had been, didn't attempt another lie. Instead, he did what every cornered manipulator does. He tried to make me the villain of his story. I was spying. I was paranoid. I was destroying our family with my suspicions and jealousy. But his words bounced off me like rain off a windshield, because I finally understood that his opinion of my behavior was irrelevant. The only opinion that mattered was the one I had of his, and that opinion was now based on evidence instead of hope. What do you do when someone's excuses become more exhausting than their crimes? I didn't scream or cry or throw things, though part of me wanted to burn everything he owned and start over with nothing but the truth. Instead, I did something that terrified him more than anger ever could. I got calm, methodical, strategic. I told him I knew about the bank accounts, the credit cards, the gym membership, the restaurant receipts, the woman, all of it. I told him I had documentation that would make a divorce attorney weep with joy and a judge shake his head in disbelief. But most importantly, I told him what was going to happen next. He was going to explain to our son why Daddy had been lying about money while spending thousands of dollars on himself, or I was going to explain it in a way that would make sure our child never forgot the lesson. The choice was his, but the secret was over. For 8 years, he had controlled the narrative of our family's financial story. Starting now, truth would be the only currency accepted in our house. His response to being exposed was exactly what I should have expected from someone who had been living a double life with sociopathic precision. He tried to negotiate reality. Maybe we could work it out. Maybe counseling could help. Maybe if I understood the pressure he was under at work, I would be more sympathetic to his need for stress relief. He offered to close the accounts, end whatever relationship he had with the woman, be more transparent about money going forward. But what he couldn't offer was to undo the years of watching our son's face fall every time he asked for something normal children had, couldn't return the moments of connection he had missed while pretending to work overtime, couldn't repair the damage done to a little boy who had learned not to want things because wanting things made Daddy stressed and sad. The most insulting part of his plea bargain was that he still expected me to manage his emotions, to make his betrayal somehow comfortable for him, to help him figure out how to be a better liar instead of demanding that he become an honest man. I realized in that moment that he was offering me the chance to become complicit in my own deception again, to help him create a more sustainable version of the same lie. But I had seen behind the curtain, had tasted what it felt like to trust my own perceptions, had remembered who I was before I learned to doubt everything I saw and felt. The woman who would have negotiated, who would have accepted partial truth as progress, who would have been grateful for scraps of honesty from the man who had been systematically starving her family. That woman was gone. In her place was someone who knew her worth, who understood that love without respect was just exploitation with better marketing, who refused to teach her son that accepting betrayal was the price of keeping peace. I looked at my husband and saw not the man I had married, but the man he had chosen to become. And I felt nothing but pity for someone who had traded his family's happiness for pleasures so shallow they required secrecy to exist. At this point in my story, I need to pause and ask you something that keeps me awake at night. If you discovered that someone you loved had been systematically lying to you and your child about money, not because they were struggling, but because they wanted to keep more for themselves, what would you do? Would you try to work it out, believing that love could overcome that level of deception and selfishness? Would you leave immediately, knowing that someone who could lie so comprehensively about something so fundamental would lie about anything? Would you seek revenge, or would you seek justice? Tell me in the comments what you think you would do, because I want to know if my response was that of a rational person or someone who had finally snapped under the weight of too many lies. Because what I did next changed everything, not just for my marriage, but for my understanding of who I really was when pushed beyond my breaking point. The plan that formed in my mind wasn't born from anger, though anger was certainly part of it. It was born from a clarity that felt almost mathematical. If he could systematically deceive us for years, then systematic exposure was the appropriate response. I didn't want to just leave him. I wanted to make sure that everyone who had ever been fooled by his performance of poverty knew exactly who they had been dealing with. I started with his family, people who had often commented on how lucky he was to have such a frugal wife who could make their family budget work so well. I sent them copies of his credit card statements, receipts from his secret purchases, evidence of the gym membership and restaurant expenses that coincided with his claims of working overtime. I wanted them to understand that their admiration for our simple living had been based on a lie, that the sacrifices they had witnessed were not choices, but consequences of his selfishness. I contacted his employer's human resources department and requested clarification about their policy on expense reimbursements, specifically asking if personal dining, gym memberships, and shopping were covered under their professional development budget. The response was swift and illuminating. None of these expenses were reimbursable, and employees were strictly forbidden from claiming personal expenses as business costs. His claims about company-required appearances and necessary professional expenses were as fabricated as everything else. I forwarded this information to our accountant, along with evidence of the false claims he had been making on our tax returns, suggesting that a complete audit of our financial situation might be prudent, given the discrepancies I had discovered. I wasn't trying to destroy him. I was trying to ensure that the truth had the same reach and persistence as his lies had maintained. The most satisfying part of my strategy was involving our son in a way that was both educational and empowering. I took him shopping for everything he had been denied over the past 3 years, not as a revenge purchase, but as a practical demonstration of financial reality. We bought school clothes that fit properly, supplies for his art projects, books from the Scholastic catalog he had been studying longingly for months. I used our joint savings account, money I had scrimped and saved while believing we were building an emergency fund together, to pay for these purchases. I explained to our son that we had always been able to afford these things, that Daddy had made choices about how to spend our family's money, and that those choices were about to change. I wanted him to understand that his needs hadn't been unreasonable, that his disappointment hadn't been necessary, that love didn't require accepting less than you deserved. The conversation with our son was the hardest and most important one of my life. I didn't want to poison his relationship with his father, but I also couldn't let him continue believing that his desires were burdens, or that family resources were genuinely scarce. I explained that sometimes adults make mistakes with money, that Daddy had been spending family money on himself instead of sharing it fairly, and that this was going to change. I told him that it was never a child's responsibility to feel guilty for wanting normal childhood experiences, that parents were supposed to sacrifice for their children, not the other way around. Most importantly, I taught him that when someone's words don't match their actions, you should believe the actions. The relief on his face as he began to understand that he hadn't been asking for too much, that his normal childhood needs weren't excessive, was worth every difficult moment that led to this conversation. The legal proceedings moved with surprising efficiency once my attorney saw the documentation I had assembled. The paper trail of hidden assets and deceptive spending practices made the case straightforward. This was financial fraud within a marriage, systematic deception that had damaged both my financial security and our child's well-being. The court was particularly unimpressed with evidence showing that he had prioritized personal luxuries over his child's basic needs, that he had created artificial scarcity while maintaining a secret abundance. The judge's comments during the settlement hearing made it clear that she had seen many divorces, but few cases where one parent had so deliberately deprived their child while indulging themselves. The financial settlement reflected not just the division of known assets, but compensation for the hidden wealth he had accumulated through years of deception. But the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the conversation I had with our son 6 months later, when he asked if I was happier now. The question caught me off guard, because I had been so focused on logistics and legal details that I hadn't stopped to assess my emotional state. As I thought about his question, I realized that I was experiencing something I had forgotten existed: peace. Not the false peace of avoiding conflict by accepting unacceptable behavior, but the genuine peace that comes from living in alignment with truth. I wasn't constantly second-guessing my perceptions, wasn't walking on eggshells around someone else's lies, wasn't teaching my child that love meant accepting betrayal. For the first time in years, our family budget was transparent, our decisions were honest, and our son's needs were prioritized without guilt or manipulation. The transformation in our son was remarkable and heartbreaking in equal measure. Within weeks of the truth coming out, he began asking for things again, small things he had trained himself not to want: a school lunch instead of a packed sandwich, a friend's birthday party he actually wanted to attend, art supplies for a project that excited him. Each request was tentative, as if he expected the old restrictions to suddenly reappear, but his growing confidence was beautiful to witness. He started bringing friends home from school, something he had avoided when he was embarrassed about our supposedly limited resources. His teachers commented on his improved mood, his increased participation, his willingness to engage in activities he had previously declined. It took months for me to realize that my son hadn't just been denied material things. He had been denied the security of knowing his place in his family was valued above his father's selfish desires. The most unexpected part of our new life was how many other mothers reached out to me once word spread about what had happened. I discovered that financial deception in marriages was far more common than I had imagined, that I wasn't the only woman who had been gaslit into believing family poverty while her spouse maintained secret abundance. Some shared stories of hidden accounts and mysterious expenses. Others talked about partners who controlled every dollar while making unauthorized purchases. Many described the same pattern of children being denied basic needs while one parent indulged in luxuries. The solidarity was powerful, but so was the recognition that I had been living in a form of financial prison that I had helped construct by accepting explanations that made no sense and trusting someone whose actions contradicted his words. The community that formed around these shared experiences became a source of strength and practical wisdom. We exchanged information about forensic accountants and divorce attorneys, about how to discover hidden assets and protect ourselves from further financial abuse. But more importantly, we helped each other remember that we deserved partnerships based on honesty and respect, that our children deserved parents who prioritized their well-being over personal gratification. Many of these women had been high achievers before marriage, competent professionals who had somehow learned to doubt their own judgment when it came to their most intimate relationship. The process of reclaiming our financial autonomy became inseparable from reclaiming our sense of self-worth and our trust in our own perceptions. 1 year after the divorce was finalized, my ex-husband attempted to re-establish a relationship with our son, promising that things would be different now that he was getting counseling and had learned from his mistakes. Our son, now 10 and remarkably wise for his age, listened to his father's apologies and promises with the kind of skeptical attention you pay to a salesperson making claims that sound too good to be true. After the visit, he asked me a question that broke my heart and filled it with pride simultaneously. "Mom, if someone lies about big things for a long time, how do you know when they're telling the truth about wanting to change?" His question revealed that he had internalized the most important lesson from our ordeal, that trust, once systematically destroyed, isn't rebuilt through words alone, but through consistent actions over time. I told our son that people can change, but that change requires not just acknowledgement of past harm, but concrete steps to prevent future harm. His father would need to demonstrate financial transparency, consistent prioritization of our son's needs, and respect for boundaries over an extended period before trust could be considered. Most importantly, I taught him that protecting himself from future disappointment wasn't cynicism. It was wisdom earned through painful experience. We agreed that we would observe actions rather than listen to promises, that we would trust incrementally rather than completely, and that our family's peace was more valuable than maintaining relationships that required us to ignore our own well-being. The financial recovery took time, but it was steady and encouraging. Without the drain of my ex-husband's secret spending, our legitimate household budget was not only manageable, but comfortable. I discovered that we had never actually been struggling financially. We had been subsidizing someone else's double life. The money that was now available for our son's activities, our home improvements, and our future security had always existed. It had just been redirected toward funding deception. I opened a college savings account for our son and showed him the statements each month, teaching him that financial planning wasn't about denying yourself everything you wanted, but about making intentional choices that reflected your values and priorities. I also rebuilt my own financial independence with the kind of determination that comes from never wanting to be vulnerable to someone else's lies again. I returned to full-time work, enrolled in courses to update my skills, and created multiple income streams that gave me security and flexibility. The professional confidence I had set aside during my marriage returned stronger than before, informed now by the hard-earned knowledge that I could handle crisis, uncover truth, and protect my family even when the threat came from within. My son watched me rebuild our life and learned that resilience wasn't about accepting difficult circumstances, but about changing them when they became unacceptable. The dating question arose occasionally from well-meaning friends, but I found myself surprisingly uninterested in romantic partnership, not because I was bitter or damaged, but because I was complete in a way I had never been before. I had learned to trust my instincts, to value honesty above harmony, to prioritize my child's well-being above all other considerations. Any future relationship would need to enhance this peace rather than threaten it, would need to demonstrate transparency rather than require surveillance, would need to add value to our family rather than extract it. I was no longer afraid of being alone, because I had learned the difference between solitude and loneliness, between independence and isolation. The most profound change was in how I approached all relationships moving forward. I stopped accepting explanations that didn't align with observable behavior, stopped making excuses for people whose actions consistently contradicted their words, stopped prioritizing others' comfort over my own clarity. This wasn't about becoming suspicious or cynical. It was about becoming selective and intentional. I taught our son these same principles, showing him that healthy relationships were built on mutual respect and honest communication, that love didn't require accepting treatment that made you feel confused or diminished. Our new life wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and honesty turned out to be the foundation upon which everything else worth having could be built. Our son thrived in an environment where his needs mattered, where financial decisions were explained rather than hidden, where love was demonstrated through actions that matched words. I thrived in a life where I could trust my own perceptions, where I didn't have to constantly question reality or make excuses for someone else's behavior. We both learned that peace wasn't the absence of problems, but the presence of truth in how we dealt with those problems. The ripple effects of choosing truth over comfort extended far beyond our immediate family. Other women in similar situations reached out for advice and support, and I found myself becoming an advocate for financial transparency in marriages and an educator about the signs of financial abuse. Speaking about my experience wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Too many people were living the same lie I had accepted. Too many children were learning the same harmful lessons about love and sacrifice that my son had internalized. The shame I had initially felt about being deceived transformed into determination to prevent others from experiencing the same systematic betrayal. If you've listened to this story and recognized elements of your own relationship, I want you to know that questioning your reality isn't betraying your marriage. It's protecting your sanity. Financial secrecy in intimate relationships isn't about privacy. It's about control. When someone who claims to love you consistently prioritizes their wants over your family's needs, that's not sacrifice or responsibility. It's selfishness disguised as virtue. Trust your instincts, document what you observe, and remember that love doesn't require you to accept less than you deserve, or to teach your children that their needs are burdens. The journey from deception to truth, from financial abuse to financial independence, from confusion to clarity, isn't easy or quick. But it's possible, and it's worth every difficult moment. Your children are watching how you respond to betrayal, learning from your example whether love means accepting lies or demanding honesty. The legacy you leave them isn't about the material things you can provide, but about the self-respect you model and the standards you maintain. They deserve to see what healthy relationships look like, what financial transparency means, what it sounds like when someone's words match their actions. My son is now 12, confident and secure in ways that seemed impossible when he was 8, and asking why Daddy had shopping bags when we supposedly had no money. He knows his worth, trusts his observations, and expects honesty from the people who claim to love him. He's learned that real love doesn't require sacrificing your needs for someone else's wants, that healthy relationships are built on mutual respect and shared priorities. Most importantly, he's learned that truth, while sometimes painful, is always preferable to lies, no matter how comfortable those lies might seem. If stories like mine resonate with your experience, if you've ever felt like you're living in someone else's version of reality while your instincts scream that something is wrong, please subscribe to this channel. Share your story in the comments, because healing happens in community, and truth becomes powerful when it's shared. The next story might be from someone who recognized themselves in mine and found the courage to trust their own perceptions. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is remind each other that we're not crazy, that our feelings are valid, that we deserve relationships built on honesty rather than deception. The mall parking lot where this all started feels like a lifetime ago, but I can still see my 8-year-old son's confused face as he asked why Daddy had bags when we had no money. That moment of innocent observation became the crack that brought down years of carefully constructed lies. Children see truth more clearly than adults because they haven't yet learned to doubt their own eyes, haven't been conditioned to accept explanations that make no sense. My son's question wasn't just about shopping bags. It was about justice, about fairness, about the fundamental expectation that the people who love you should prioritize your well-being over their own pleasure. Today, when we go shopping together, there are no lies about what we can or cannot afford. Our budget is transparent, our priorities are clear, and our decisions reflect our values, rather than someone else's deception. My son asks for things without shame, accepts no when it's based on honest limitations rather than fabricated ones, and understands the difference between want and need because he's never been made to feel guilty for having either. The shopping bags in our car represent choices we make together, needs we meet without secrecy, and a future we're building on the foundation of truth, rather than the quicksand of lies. The woman who stood in that parking lot 3 years ago, confused and hurt, but not yet ready to trust her own eyes, feels like someone I used to know, rather than someone I used to be. She was a good person caught in an impossible situation, gaslit into doubting her own sanity, conditioned to accept cruelty disguised as sacrifice. But she was also stronger than she knew, more perceptive than she had been taught to believe, and more deserving of honesty than she had learned to expect. The transformation from that woman to this one wasn't magic. It was choice, courage, and the radical decision to trust truth over comfort, reality over fantasy, self-respect over false peace. My message to anyone living in the shadow of someone else's lies is simple but profound. You deserve a life where your perceptions are trusted, where your needs matter, where love is demonstrated through actions that align with words. You deserve financial transparency, emotional honesty, and partnership that enhances rather than diminishes your well-being. Your children deserve to see what healthy love looks like, to learn that their needs are priorities rather than burdens, to understand that real sacrifice flows from love toward those you cherish, not from those you cherish toward your selfish desires. The bags my husband carried that day weren't just shopping bags. They were symbols of choices he made every day to prioritize himself over his family, to maintain his comfort at our expense, to teach our son that his father's wants mattered more than his needs. But they were also the evidence I needed to finally trust what I had been seeing, to validate what I had been feeling, to take action based on truth rather than hope. Sometimes the most mundane moments contain the most profound revelations, and sometimes a child's innocent question can shatter years of adult self-deception. If you want more stories about finding truth in relationships, about protecting your children from manipulation disguised as love, about transforming betrayal into empowerment, subscribe now and join a community of people who believe that honesty is the only foundation upon which lasting love can be built. Your story matters, your experience has value, and your journey toward truth, however difficult, is worth sharing. Because somewhere, someone is standing in a parking lot wondering if they're seeing what they think they're seeing, and they need to know that they can trust their eyes, trust their instincts, and trust that they deserve better than a life built on someone else's lies.